Okay, today we're going to discuss sport and history. You can't you can't look to the future if we don't understand the past and what occurred with sports in the past. So as you see in this mural right here in this Latino neighborhood, you see the cultural representation of the past and how they've transformed and linked that, merged it with the cultural representation of sport in their community today. So there are variations in cultural and historical relationships with sports. You see here, sports are a cultural practice, and they can serve different communities, different cultures in a various number of ways. We living in social worlds, we create sports that fit within the constraints that we experience in our social world. And that's key. And you're going to see throughout history how this has played out. Looking at this cartoon, organized sports are a fairly new phenomenon. They weren't around in ancient history, and you're going to see what the emphasis of sports were in the past as opposed to today. You see some dominant characteristics of today's sports form: secularism, equality, specialization, rationalization. These are all things that we're going to discuss throughout the course. And the next slide will demonstrate. You see all the way on the far right, modern sports. All of those characteristics exist today. And then you can look from the Greek games, Roman games, medieval games, Renaissance. During those times, you can get an idea and see what existed, which characteristics in sports existed. And we're going to cover this more in depth as we touch upon each of the ideologies we'll discuss in this course. So starting in ancient Greece, the games were grounded in mythology. They were linked with the beliefs of religions at the time. A lot of the characteristics of sports, you were excluded based on your gender. Females were not allowed. Frequent violence. There were no really administrative structures that were organizing these events. We didn't keep track of stats or measurements as we do in games today. Dominant ideology in society in the past, we celebrated masculinity. You were dominant if you were aggressive. That conquest that demonstrated your dominance in sports in the past and even into today. During Roman games, the emphasis was on spectacle, and you will see that in the film that we will watch in class. The magnitude of the spectacle, the combat that was involved, and it was a demonstration of the power of political leaders, and power is going to be a key theme that is going to be reappearing throughout our course. During this time, the sports were created as a diversion for the masses. Women were still not athletes, so much, and there was no quantifying, keeping records, no stats. During the time of medieval Europe, peasants played folk games, and tournaments were organized, but they were primarily to prepare the military for battle and distinguish who's our dominant warriors, our dominant soldiers. There were gender restrictions, and these were based on the religious views and beliefs of the time and the exclusion of females. There was no specialization in games, and again, no formal organization. You're seeing these themes play out in different time periods. During the Renaissance, Reformation, and the Enlightenment periods, it was a way for governments to control peasants. You were restricted, you were working, you were laboring. There was not time for games. The Calvinist and Puritan beliefs of the time, they did not support or promote leisure time. So if sports were around, again, it was a diversion for people. Take their mind off of the restrictions that are placed on them, the control that is being placed over them. During the early years of the Industrial Revolution, this is when we see organized competitive sports emerging, but it was more for the elite. Just very similar to today, and I know there are changes in urban areas, but time and space for games were limited in those areas. And with the exploitation and slavery among Africans and other work, there was limited widespread involvement. There was some involvement in sports, but because of some of these issues, these exploitations, it wasn't as widespread as we see today. So some history lessons that we can learn. And we need to think about these things when we're studying sports. Who's telling these stories about what it was like when we weren't around? What perspective is this story being framed under? And how is the power related to whose stories are told and how they're told? Power is going to be a dominant theme. You're going to hear me say that over and over again. Who's telling the story? Is it the story being told by those in power or those who are seeking to gain power? And then another question to ask is, why are histories usually incomplete? Are we getting both sides of the story, both views, perspectives? Key things to think about as we move through this course. Capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, the motives behind that were not to create play or play spaces. Okay, it didn't lead to profits. But as children, by nature, children explore. They want to play. They want to express themselves. So they found ways to play during this time period, even though it wasn't being promoted culturally. The later years of the Industrial Revolution, now there's this growing emphasis on organization in society and in sports. The segregation still is present with race and class, and women's participation was not non-existent. It was just very limited during these times. From 1880 to 1920, competitive sports in the United States were a way for wealthy people to flaunt their status, reinforce they're better than everyone. The organization, how sports were organized, it favored these people with power and wealth. And again, there's that power and wealth. These are themes that are going to continue to come to the forefront as we move through the course. Sport participation opportunities for workers, especially the men, they were there. Baseball was created for men. We always talk about sports being for children. Well, the game of baseball was created for these workers to, after work, blow off some steam. Some more information this time period. The link of participating in sports starts to come to the forefront of that character development. Things we think about now. If I asked you your participation in sport, what did it provide you? You might talk about some of these character traits that developed. So they start being tied to masculinity, femininity, skin color, ethnicity, age, disability. These are all topics that we will cover in depth later in the course. So the early 20th century weren't a lot of opportunities for girls and women to engage in physical activities. And the ones they were involved with, we're seeing femininity come out here. The emphasis on grace and beauty as a ladylike character. These were the activities that girls and women were engaged in. So from the 20s to today, struggles continue over the meaning, purpose, organization of sports in cultural areas, communities, society as a whole. Who's going to participate in sports? What are the conditions under which they'll play? how and why sports are sponsored. So the struggles are related to these issues. And I'm not going to go in depth into these because we're going to dive deeper into this as we progress through the course. But these are some of the main topics that we're going to discuss moving forward. And the struggles, they happen then, they happen now, and we'll talk about ways to minimize the impact of these. So disability throughout history, usually associated with revulsion, shame, limitations. And if you have a disability, you may have experienced as being defined as an other, segregated from other people. Attempts by people to normalize someone with a disability. This is kind of how disabilities have been portrayed. The histories of sports are linked to struggles over political ideologies. We'll talk about politics in sports and what that means. Those that break barriers and are given an opportunity, they pave the way for the future, they oftentimes, once they break through that barrier, they're being scrutinized their entire life. And people are cheering for them to succeed on one side, and on the other side, people want them to fail. So they are on trial, as you see here, until they die. Back to these struggles over the meaning, purpose, organization, conditions of participation, sponsorship. These are 5 main things that we need to look at with sports. If we really want to break down sport, history, and the future, these are 5 areas that we really need to look at, and we will. Okay, sports history does not just happen. It's the social construction of people in their social world. And how things change, someone or a group of people have a vision of where sports are at and where they could and should be. And that's where you are in this course, depending on your career path. If you're going to be involved with sports at any level, it's going to be up to you to have a vision and carry out the vision by asking some of the questions that we're going to ask in this course. So concluding this discussion on sport history, it's always going to emerge in connection with struggles people are going through, their ideals, and the way you organize sports or you envision sports, it's going to be different than other people. So we have to look and take your visions, your reality in your social world, and how can you improve? How can you improve it in your social world or in a broader societal perspective? You see that last sentence there, sitting on the bench takes you out of the game. You have to have a vision, take your vision, turn it into a reality, but you must understand the past and the struggles of those that have come before us to be able to progress to the future. But if you sit there and do nothing, that vision will never become a reality. All right, I hope this has given you a little bit of information on sport and sport history. We will continue the discussion. Thanks for watching.